And we will go on to the next presentation by Claire Murphy-Morgan and Lesley-Ann Smith, assessing public perspectives of parapsychology through Facebook, a discourse analysis utilizing Graham's hierarchy of disagreement.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So I'll just set my timer so I don't run over. So yes, why is social media of importance to parapsychology? Well, parapsychology, I don't need to tell anybody here, it continues to be perceived as controversial in the wider public sphere, and this is obviously reflected online. So, for example, the categorization of parapsychology as a pseudoscience on Wikipedia, and also explorations from wider literature from Martin and Craig Weiler in his book Psy Wars about how parapsychology is often censored or removed. So, for example, Rupert Sheldrake's famous TED Talk on the science delusion was removed from the TED Talks website. So there's a lot of exploration about how that shaped in the online sphere. Boyd in 2010 talked about networked publics, and this is really important in terms of looking at social media, in that the public are ever more generating, sharing, discussing, and consuming information. So the public are no longer passive recipients of information, they're part of that process of generating information and misinformation. And Tudickin and Kramer have looked at that more recently in the context of science communication, but not in the context of parapsychology specifically. So we've begun to build on our recent research looking at YouTube, which is very parapsychology focused, and we found evidence of confirmation bias in terms of both sort of proponents and skeptics, if you like, of parapsychology. Skepticism, I'm going to come to a little bit later on. It's very widely examined the phenomenon of polarization in discussion on social media across a wide range of areas, politics, even entertainment, for example. But again, the literature has not looked at that regarding parapsychology, and also looking at how ever evolving social media platforms and their functionalities and affordances shape the conversation about parapsychology. So I haven't got a lot of time today to talk a bit about, in more detail about Facebook, but just a very broad overview of what it is. It is it's a platform where people can post comments, images, links. Unlike Twitter, for example, there's no word or character limit. People can like and share posts. They can talk about things in quite a lot of depth on Facebook. There tends to be more equal participation in discussion than, say, on YouTube. And it's an important platform for assessing public discourse and the potential for polarization. So in our study, we have assessed the first 250 responses posted in response to a real live Facebook feed. Is there any evidence of psychic powers? So somebody in the public, just a general member of the public, has posted that. So we have used Graham's hierarchy of disagreement to look at and to describe how the conversation is formulated. And on this image here, this is the diagram of Paul Graham's tool that he's developed. So you can see at the bottom of the pyramid, name calling, so things like "you are an asshat," right to the very top of the pyramid, which is explicitly refuting the central point. So there are all those kind of spectrum, if you will, of different ways in which people can respond to somebody who's put a previous posting before them. Then in the second step, and this is an in-progress paper, we are currently applying a discourse analysis process to sort of further analyse the data and examine the conversation in a kind of a wider social context, because clearly this conversation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of the online world, if you like. So in terms of our results, perhaps not surprisingly, there were higher scores on the bottom end of the pyramid. So the most frequently type of comment observed was ad hominem. So by that I mean the attempt of the person responding to a comment to try and discredit the authority of the person who has posted the previous comment, which we'll look at in a moment. Contradiction was also the second most recorded type of frequently observed comment. And interestingly, for social media and for Facebook in particular, responding to tone was the third most frequently recorded type of comment. So here's some example, hot off the press from our data set. So ad hominem, and these are paraphrased from the data set following the British Psychological Society guidelines for intermediated research, because obviously none of these people posting on Facebook have signed up to being part of a study. It may be publicly available information, but we're still trying to preserve the anonymity of the individuals. So ad hominem, for example, what scientific papers have you published? Real degrees, not the one you have studied. Don't teach such supernatural nonsense. And that was somebody who actually has a parapsychological degree, was responded to by that comment. So contradiction, so responding without providing any evidence to back it up. So, for example, does your definition of being a psychic focus only on making money, tricking people? I thought you were interested in scientific theory. Answer, there is no evidence to support this at all. People who claim to have these powers are only in it for the money. And responding to tone, examples, I don't need to justify myself to you. I'm not having a go, and bye-bye. Discourse analysis, so this is still to be drilled down and to have a discursive approach to really get into the soil of the data, but this is all kind of the headlines hot off the press, if you like, is that the original question frames the conversation from a materialist paradigm. The original asker of the question says, I know this is a strange question, so why would asking about psychic powers or psi be a strange question? But yes, I guess in the materialist paradigm. Entrenched positions of argument. So, for example, there's no evidence for any of this. Look, everybody, psychic ability does not exist. Forget about it and do something else. What I thought was also really interesting was the weaponization of links to support a comment or claim. So a number of people, in response to somebody saying, look, psi and psychic ability is worthy of further explanation or exploration, people would bung out YouTube, and James Randi as the YouTube links was the most widely shared, and Sheldrake on telepathy was also shared, but links were either ignored or met by dismissal. So there was no attempt to look at what people were saying. There was a broad agreement on what skepticism is, that skepticism's healthy, but disagree on what skepticism actually is, and that needs further exploration. And the good old misinformation and anecdotes, you know, you won't get anything from Sci researchers, they just quote each other and share anecdotes. And in summary, conversation about parapsychology on Facebook appears to be polarised, with ad hominem, contradiction and responding to tone at the bottom of Graham's hierarchy, the most frequently observed types of responses. The weaponisation of links is very interesting, and very mixed and inconsistent knowledge and understanding of the concept of scepticism, and again, misinformation. Obviously, the implications for parapsychology is that social media is a battleground, and how can that be met? And the nuances of tone is also difficult in terms of formulating and responding. Skepticism and what that is, as far as the public's concerned, very important. And again, further entrenched views and confirmation bias to support some of the previous literature. I haven't got time to look at strengths and limitations, but I'm very happy to. There's my references, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So we have time for a couple of questions.
Thanks, Claire. I was just wondering what was the context of the data that you've got? I mean, was it on a particular type of Facebook group?
So it was on it wasn't on a Facebook group. It was actually on a thread of a colleague of ours who does work in the psychical research area. So that is something that we need to talk about, because that could potentially colour or present the data in a particular way. The rest were members of the general public. So it wasn't the colleague of ours who's posted it. It was a friend of his from the general public said, I think this is a very strange question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any evidence of psi? And then the friends of theirs on Facebook kind of piled in. And then a colleague of ours then basically took part in the conversation.
Okay, I mean, I only asked because the survey study that I did, I used Facebook, and I looked at vegan and vegetarian groups and fasting groups, none of whom were particularly, you know, well, actually some of them were related maybe to spirituality, but most of them weren't. And actually, I expected more pushback about the topic of the research, but I didn't. I mean, I got the odd instance, but not very many. So I just, you know, actually most people were like, oh, isn't it great that you're doing this kind of research? So that's kind of why I asked the context.
Sure. But I do think that's a limitation, that obviously there was a parapsychologist involved in the conversation. So I think it would be really useful to run the conversation again with the general public. But the rest of the people involved in the thread were members of the public, some of whom had an interest in psychical research and some of whom very definitely didn't, and thought it was a lot of nonsense. But so it's quite an interesting data set in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah, I've spent some of my time engaging with skeptics, and it's a rather frustrating experience. But this is one stage further. I would feel it's rather futile. Have you ever come across a dialogue that has been constructive, that has led to a nearing of different opinions or a meaningful exchange?
It's really interesting you've asked me that question, because actually I have come across a more meaningful exchange, and it was a part of a presentation yesterday, which is the Uncanny podcast, which was Felicity's presentation. And the Uncanny podcast, BBC podcast, has, on the back of that, there is the hashtag Uncanny Community on Twitter. So the way that Uncanny is kind of formulated, it's almost presented as a detective story. So a member of the public on each episode presents their experience, and then there are a number of both sort of proponents and skeptics, if you will, that will maybe try and analyse what's going on. But what the Uncanny, it's so popular, it's generated the Uncanny community, and that has facilitated some quite constructive engagement on Twitter, believe it or not, from people who are both believers and non-believers, in such a way that people are not shouting at each other. And I think the way that that programme is constructed and the conversation is set is actually a really interesting model, and I am actually looking at that particular programme as a potential model for having the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Claire.
Thank you.